At 2:45 a.m. yesterday, the hush over Kyiv was shattered by the hum of encrypted bursts, rippling through Ukraine's military intelligence channels. Below ground, a command center glowed cold blue with live maps, and Ukrainian analysts were piecing together something extraordinary. What they uncovered wasn't a mere route, it was the architecture of a clandestine $6 billion military program, orchestrated by China, concealed behind layers of commercial disguise, and designed to funnel strategic aid directly into Russia's war machine. Over months, a series of faint clues, suspicious trade patterns, obscure shell companies coalesced into a clear pattern pointing toward Beijing. Ukrainian cyber units, aided by Western intelligence, intercepted logistics and financial data confirming the connection. The data exposed a network of Chinese state firms exporting dual-use technology. These shipments were disguised as legitimate industrial equipment, but were in reality critical components for Russia's missile guidance, drone navigation, and radar jamming capabilities. The discovery didn't come from a single clue. It came from a mosaic of intelligence, satellite imagery, intercepted radio chatter, customs data, and corporate records buried in obscure offshore registries. By cross-referencing these datasets, Ukraine's analysts uncovered a shadow structure involving over 30 front companies spread across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Each one acted as a conduit, masking the origin of Chinese-manufactured components before they reached Russian assembly facilities. A critical breakthrough came from leaked shipping records from China's Ningbo port. They showed containers labeled agricultural machinery actually held high-grade microprocessors and optical sensors, components identical to those in Russian Orlan-10 drones and Kh-101 cruise missiles. What was speculation became evidence. The program's scale stunned officers. A $6 billion financial footprint across Chinese state banks, disguised as trade credits and industrial projects. State defense firms like Norinco and CETC were also implicated, tied indirectly to subsidiaries that had quietly increased exports to Russia. This clandestine system relied on plausible deniability. While China claimed legitimate commerce, goods were routed through intermediary nations like Kazakhstan and the United Arab Emirates to bolster Moscow's military. It was a balancing act, public calls for peace, private support for the war. Analysts in Kyiv quickly realized this was not simple sanction evasion, but deliberate strategic coordination. This calculated effort, designed to keep Russia's military viable, also solved a mystery. Why Russian weapon systems, previously failing from component shortages, had suddenly returned to full operation. By 3 a.m., the data was consolidated into a classified report marked Tier 1 priority. Within hours, it was on President Zelensky's desk. The Ukrainian government, now accustomed to high-stakes intelligence disclosures, moved quickly to share the information with allied nations. According to early briefings, this Chinese program was not only facilitating component transfers, but was also providing Russia with battlefield intelligence through commercial satellites. Several Chinese civilian imaging companies, often described as private enterprises, had been supplying the Kremlin with high-resolution surveillance data from Ukrainian front lines. One such company, a Shenzhen startup, received an unexplained $400 million investment from a defense-linked fund. Ukrainian analysts found it was routing satellite data packages through a Moscow distributor directly to Russia's general staff. This transfer allowed Russian commanders to track troop movements and optimize missile strikes, a clear violation of neutrality. This exposure comes at a critical moment. Russia, forced by sanctions to rely on imported technology, has somehow continued producing advanced weapons. While Chinese involvement was long suspected, concrete proof was elusive. This $6 billion program is that proof, representing not just material aid, but a deep political commitment from Beijing to support Moscow. At 5:15 a.m., as Kyiv's streets began to fill with the first commuters of the day, Ukrainian officials finalized their preliminary report for NATO partners. Its contents were clear. China had developed a covert, state-backed military assistance network worth $6 billion, an operation hidden behind a facade of commercial cooperation. The report concluded that dismantling this network would be as strategically important as intercepting Russian missiles. Both, it said, were weapons, one of steel and explosives, the other of economics and deceit. By mid-morning, the echoes of last night's discovery had already reached foreign intelligence hubs across Europe and North America. Inside the Joint Intelligence Coordination Center in Warsaw, analysts were busy verifying Ukraine's findings. Dozens of encrypted cables flowed in from Kyiv, detailing the names of logistics companies, shipping routes, and financial accounts used in China's secret program. At 10 a.m., Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, or GUR, activated its Horizon Task Force, a cyber espionage unit specialized in tracking global trade movements. Their mission was monumental: map every route, every vessel, and every financial node connected to China's covert operations. Within hours, patterns began to emerge. Dozens of container ships registered under flags of convenience had followed suspicious routes between China's coast and Russia's Far East ports. Many made inconspicuous stops in third countries, where cargo was reclassified as civilian material before being redirected north. The most revealing case emerged from Vladivostok, where satellite images captured unusual night activity. Containers were seen moving from Chinese vessels directly onto trains headed for Moscow assembly plants, timing that perfectly matched surges in Russian missile production. One train was tracked to a Rostec-controlled warehouse in Belarus, a known hub for Iranian drone parts, where it offloaded Chinese optical guidance modules. The physical link was established. Digitally, Ukrainian cyber units breached intermediary firms, including Kaztech Dynamics in Kazakhstan. Officially an agricultural electronics supplier, it was actually a clearinghouse for Chinese military-grade circuitry. Hackers found invoices on its servers for controlled items like microcontrollers and laser gyroscopes, matching Chinese shipment records. When the findings were presented to NATO's Economic Security Division, the reaction was immediate. The data pointed to an organized network that had operated undetected for nearly 2 years. Western sanctions had slowed Russia, but China had quietly stepped in to fill the void. What truly alarmed Western officials was how deeply embedded this network was within the global economy. Many intermediary firms were listed as joint ventures with European or Middle Eastern investors, giving them an appearance of legitimacy. At 1:30 p.m., a classified interagency meeting was held in Brussels. Representatives from the European Commission, NATO, and several intelligence agencies reviewed Ukraine's evidence. One senior official reportedly described the findings as a shadow supply chain built with the precision of a state actor. Discussions quickly shifted from verification to response. Should they confront Beijing quietly to avoid escalation? While diplomats debated, Ukraine acted. By the afternoon, its defense forces had launched a coordinated cyber operation targeting logistics databases across Eastern Europe. The goal was to freeze the digital pathways used by Chinese intermediary. Within hours, dozens of access points went dark. Shipments awaiting clearance at ports in Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan suddenly stalled. Ukraine throttled the pipeline with an invisible blockade. The operation was subtle yet devastating. No bombs, no drones, just data. The ripple effect spread quickly. Russian defense factories began reporting shortages again. The very lifeline China's secret program had built was collapsing. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials began quietly briefing the media. Key outlets in Europe and North America started publishing reports citing Western intelligence sources, confirming China's covert assistance. Beijing, sensing the backlash, issued a swift denial. A spokesperson dismissed the allegations as baseless disinformation, claiming strict control over all dual-use exports. But the denials rang hollow. The evidence was too precise. By early evening, markets in Asia began reacting nervously. Investors feared potential secondary sanctions. The Chinese yuan dipped. Inside China's Ministry of Commerce, emergency meetings were convened. The immediate concern was not the exposure itself, but the possibility that Western agencies could trace the full money trail. The $6 billion program wasn't simple aid. It was layered with state-backed loans and covert grant. A financial unraveling could reveal how deeply the Chinese state apparatus was involved. At 8:45 p.m., Ukraine's defense minister delivered a televised statement. Calm but deliberate, he announced that foreign actors had been identified supporting Russia's aggression, emphasizing that Ukraine possessed irrefutable proof. While he avoided naming China directly, the implications were unmistakable. The world was now watching. In Moscow, the reaction was equally tense. Russia's reliance on China risked becoming a liability. If Beijing retreated under pressure, Russia's fragile supply chains would collapse entirely. Several defense officials reportedly warned the Kremlin that advanced missile production could stall within weeks. For Ukraine, this was a strategic victory without firing a single shot. The story didn't end there. Late that night, Ukrainian intelligence intercepted communications between Russian logistics officers and their Chinese counterparts. The messages were terse, frustrated, and filled with concern over halted deliveries. One Russian officer complained that, "Our partners in Shenzhen have gone silent." The very network that had sustained Russia's war industry was now unraveling in real time. Today at midnight, the skies over Kyiv were calm. No air raid alarms, only the silent hum of data flowing through secure channels. The operation had succeeded beyond expectation. But Ukrainian analysts knew this wasn't over. China would adapt. New routes would be built. The war of intelligence, like the war on the battlefield, was far from finished. By the following morning, the tremors of Ukraine's revelation had reached every major capital. From Washington to Brussels, policymakers woke to headlines that laid bare China's covert $6 billion military support program. In Beijing, officials scrambled to contain the diplomatic firestorm. The foreign ministry issued a second statement, calling the accusations politically motivated fabrications. But behind closed doors, there was panic. Intercepted communications revealed frantic discussions about shutting down sensitive export projects. The secrecy of the program had been its greatest strength. Now, it was its greatest vulnerability. For years, China had positioned itself as a neutral player, but Ukraine's evidence shattered that illusion. At 9 a.m. Kyiv time, the European Union convened an emergency session. Intelligence officers from Ukraine presented their full dossier. The documents were undeniable. Bank transfers, false export licenses, satellite data showing direct transfers to Russian ports. One European official described the evidence as an industrial-scale deception. By noon, the response was underway. The EU announced an expanded sanctions package targeting Chinese entities. Across the Atlantic, the White House declared that any nation enabling Russia's war efforts will face serious consequences. The US Treasury prepared sanctions capable of freezing billions in international assets. The markets responded immediately. Shares of Chinese defense and logistics firms plummeted. The ruble dipped again. But perhaps the most significant fallout was diplomatic. China had been courting European nations with post-war reconstruction deals. Those conversations froze overnight. In Berlin, the French and German leaders called for a complete reassessment of Europe's relationship with China. China's attempt to act as a global peacemaker had imploded. In Moscow, the mood turned grim. The Chinese supply chain was essential. An internal review by the Russian Defense Ministry found less than 40% of the needed electronics for the next quarter's production remained available. For Ukraine, this was a strategic triumph. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba addressed the nation. "We have shown the world that no secret stays hidden forever. Every false friend of peace will eventually be unmasked." Beijing now faced a dilemma: escalate and risk full-scale economic confrontation, or quietly dismantle the program. By the end of the week, reports emerged that several Chinese defense executives had been detained for violating export regulations. They were scapegoats, part of Beijing's effort to contain the scandal. The $6 billion program was being buried quietly. In Ukraine, the revelation energized the public. Western allies, meanwhile, rallied closer to Kyiv. New packages of defense aid were announced. In Moscow, frustration deepened. The silence from Beijing, once a whisper of quiet partnership, had turned into an echoing void. The Kremlin was alone again. As midnight approached, Kyiv's intelligence monitors watched the last faint digital signatures of China's suspended shipments fading from the global network. One officer turned to his commander and simply said, "It's over." In that moment, Ukraine had not only disrupted a secret empire of war, it had shown the world that truth itself could be the most powerful weapon of all.